Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva. You know, it's always nice when we can have a return visit with a guest, be it here in studio or via the technical wizardry of satellite. And we have a gentleman who actually is always makes it a point to stop by and see us when he's traveling around talking about his latest book. He's a renowned Beatles scholar, also loves talking about Star Wars and several other things, JFK and the rise of the Beatles. So again, he is joining us. His name is Aaron Krerowicz. He's got a brand new book called Flipside Beatles, Volume 1. And we'll find out what other volumes hopefully will come about. And the nice thing about this is you see what looks like kind of a replica of the old Beatles Apple label. This is Beatles Band of the 60s, Volume 1, and then nothing up my sleeve, voila. If you flip it over, you have what used to be, I think for the most part, pretty universal, the half-carved flip side on an old 45 Children, which some of you may not know what I'm talking about, but this would be the flip side of an LP or an album. And the back side of the book deals with Ringo Starr, a section called Star Time, a celebration of Ringo. And again, as you can see, I'll kind of give you a little hint here. You see how the pages are again for you to read. And then if you flip it over so that you now have, again, another magic trick. And then there you go. Then there's hearing all about Ringo and his influences and contributions with probably as many would say, one of the greatest bands in music history. So we have him here with us, joining us again, Aaron Krerowicz. Aaron, well, nice of you to stop by and bring this magic trick.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for having me yet again.
Absolutely, absolutely. And remind me again before I forget your website, again, for more information.
Certainly, yeah, it's just flipsidebeatles.com.
Excellent, excellent. So again, as we said, the book, or I should say it's really two books almost encompassed in one. How did the idea for the book come about?
Sure, yeah. So my background is as a composer and as a music theorist. And so my approach to this band is a musical one, musically analytical one. And most Beatles experts are experts in the history and the biography of the band. Who did what, where, why, when, how, all that kind of stuff. And that's absolutely fascinating. But it's not music. History and music are different things, and it struck me that there's not enough musical consideration for this band. What makes the Beatles special is the music, and yet all the books that are out there deal with history. And so I decided to analyze the music in my presentations. The book then is a transcript of two of those presentations. So as you mentioned earlier, the A side is the most popular one I have. It's called the Beatles Band of the 60s. It's an overview of this band. We started in 1960. We go year by year, album by album, through their breakup in 1970. And then the B side, you flip it over and you get the B side, and that's a transcript of another one of my programs called Star Time, a celebration of Ringo. And Ringo, as I say in the introduction, Ringo Starr gets no love. In fact, he just released a new album called Give More Love, yeah, which I had no idea, but those are the first words of the book. Ringo Starr gets no love because so many people that I've talked to say, you know, he was the luckiest man in the history of music, that he got to be with John, Paul, and George. And I even had one guy email me and say, Ringo's the luckiest guy, so I've always considered George Martin to be the fourth Beatle. You know, there's all this talk about who's the fifth Beatle. Sure. Well, this guy considers George Martin the fourth Beatle, not Ringo to be the fourth Beatle. And so I said, you know what? I need to give Ringo his due here. And so the B-side contains four parts. It looks first at his personality, because I believe it was Ringo's personality more than his actual drumming that's responsible for kicking Pete Best out and bringing Ringo in. Second is his drumming, and I look a lot at his drumming, the different beats that he uses, and the way he will reinforce song structure by changing his beats. So when you go from a verse to a bridge, you know, he'll change the way the patterns that he does. Third, looks at his abilities as a singer. Ringo typically gets one song per album. That's not entirely true. He doesn't sing anything on A Hard Day's Night, but in general, he gets one song per album. So I go through all the songs that Ringo sings with the Beatles. Fourth and finally are his songwriting. So songs that Ringo contributed to the writing or wrote entirely on his own. So I look at those four things all as a way to say, look how much Ringo contributed to the biggest rock band of all time.
There you go. And we'll talk a little bit more about that flip side, side B, in a little bit. First, we're going to spend on the first half, or the A side of the book, Beatles Band of the 60s, to touch base on what you were saying before. In my opinion, again, and it was only towards the latter end, when I hear Fifth Beatle, the kind of popular culture one was in the early days. They said, oh, Murray the K was the fifth Beatle, okay, you know, because he used to be a disc jockey back in the early 60s.
I think there's about 7 fifth Beatles.
Yeah, my cousin Brucey, you know, Bruce Morrow, who, God bless us, is still around on satellite radio, and so many others. To me, the fifth Beatle, even though it was towards from like 68 on, was Billy Preston. I mean, if you hear contributions there, others might say even Eric Clapton, although that was very minimal in the great scheme of things. Others would say, like you said, George Martin, because George, I think the reason it was a well-oiled machine wasn't because, well, they listened to everything Little Richard, the Everly Brothers did, Buddy Holly. No, these were, you know, it's like a rough diamond. It had to be polished, and George Martin, in my opinion, was just the guy to do it.
Absolutely, and he had classical training and extensive experience as a musician before he ever even met the Beatles. None of the Beatles had formal training. I think Paul and George took a few weeks of guitar lessons, and that was the extent of their formal musical education. What they had instead was Hamburg in the early 60s, and so that's where the book starts, is their trip to Hamburg in 1960, and that is the equivalent of their education. And so they bring all these raw, you know, John, Paul, George, and Ringo bring all these raw songs to George Martin, and as you said, he polishes that. He takes those raw, intuitive compositions and elevates them into massively commercially and artistically successful diamonds.
And at the same time, undisputably, in my opinion, raised their game, because again, they wouldn't have done things like Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper and on if they didn't also learn something from George Martin as well.
Yeah, that's true. They were very much students of the recording process. You know, when they first started, they were very green. They had no idea how the recording process worked, and Martin was an old pro by the early 60s. You know, he had worked throughout the 50s with the Goons and Peter Sellers, mostly comedy records, and so he had all this practice recording different sounds, and as he put it, painting sound pictures. And so when the Beatles come and they ask him things like, well, can we do you know, like tape loops on Tomorrow Never Knows on Revolver? George says, yeah, sure, we can do that. You know, I've done this before, or done something similar in the past. So I'm gonna take what I learned before I met the Beatles and apply it to the Beatles. And it's that combination, you know, the band itself and the producer George Martin that I think goes a long way to making the Beatles the Beatles.
And in some ways too, I'll also throw in that I think not raised his game, because he was, to me, I thought a thorough professional on so many levels for the reason you mentioned. But there was one story you tell in the book about, I'm going to say it was either during Magical Mystery Tour or Sgt. Pepper, where John, or I think it was John, asked him to do something, and he was like at first stymied, like, how am I going to do this? And it wasn't 100% perfect, like a perfect cut, like on either an editing block or however they used to do that, like we did in radio back in the day. But the thing was, I think in some ways then their naivete and then their getting smarter also kept him sharp as well, because he had to constantly, they wanted more and therefore he gave them more.
He had to find ways to make it work. So yeah, the story that I tell in the book that's now quite famous is Strawberry Fields Forever. They do 2 versions of Strawberry Fields, one that's very slow and light, and another that's faster and heavier with trumpets and cellos. And so John says, you know what, I like them both. So why don't we start with the slow one and end with the fast one? And of course that's a major problem, because they're in different keys and they're in different tempos. And had George Martin made that edit that Lennon asked him to do without compensating for both tempo and tonality, the edit would have been brutal. You know, if you listen to it, I have a Beatles minute video that plays what it would have sounded like had he made the straight edit. And it's very obvious. The whole point of editing, of course, is to hide the edit. So if a piece of music sounds edited, then it's a bad edit. And it's a testament to George Martin and his skill as a producer that he found a way to make it work. And the solution is what's known as varispeed. So when you're playing when you're using analog recording methods, which is to say tape as opposed to digital, like is now the standard, you can speed up the pitch. And instead of playing back at normal speed, if you play it faster, if you speed up the playback, it raises the pitch and quickens the tempo. And then for the slow version, that's what they did. Rather than play it back at normal speed, they turned it up. And then for the fast version, instead of play that at normal speed, they turn it down, and that lowers the pitch and slows the tempo. And it's the biggest coincidence in the entire Beatles chronicle that the two of them met perfectly halfway in between. Wasn't planned, just so happened that it worked out, and that's what we hear.
Something tells me we'll call it the drug culture that was going on at that point. I don't think a lot of folks were really noticing that, but obviously folks that. Which became apparent later on with that whole "is Paul is dead" controversy. I think we talked about that the last time you were here. I mean, they were like, scrutinizing every sound. I mean, why is this played backwards? Why is this sound the way it is? Why does that photo? There's a crack in one of the letters. That means something Beatle as opposed to it's remarkable, and it's all. I think my own opinion. It's all just all happenstance. I don't think there's a second Paul running around it. Right. If he is, he's doing quite well for himself.
Well, one of people always ask me about the Paul is dead thing, and one of my standard responses is, if they did find someone to replace Paul, that someone is spectacularly good. Yeah. Like not only did they lose the original Paul, who was a world-class talent, but they found a second equally talented person to continue.
They did what American Idol could never do in 15 years. They just went out and scoured every pub in Liverpool and in England, for that matter.
Yeah. So it's nonsense. It's all fans reading. It's all fans finding meaning where there is no meaning.
Yeah, the old conspiracy theory to a more cultural take rather than anything evil. Although I guess people did think, that someone perhaps had done Paul harm or something. I don't know. Speaking of Paul, I want to ask about, we talked about just before we went on air.
Yes.
I've seen some of the ties you've worn when you've done some publicity shots and different things. I said, he's not wearing one of those ties. And I looked at it and I said, why does that look familiar? It is, in a way. It's Paul, a replica of Paul's bass guitar. But finish the story. What's wrong with that picture?
Yeah, so I wear Beatles ties almost every day because I do these presentations all over the place, and so I'm constantly on the lookout for rock and roll ties, in particular Beatles ties. And so I've got a Sgt. Pepper one, I've got a Revolver one, I've got a White Album one. I mean, I've got all this massive collection of Beatles ties now. And so when I saw one that advertised as Paul McCartney's bass, I thought, I have to have this.
Sure.
And this was actually online. It wasn't in person. So I find this tie available for purchase, Paul McCartney bass tie, and immediately bought it. Didn't look very closely at it. And then it arrives in the mail a week later, and I look at it and I think, wait a minute, this isn't Paul's bass. Paul is left-handed. This is a right-handed bass guitar.
Well,
so I don't know what the
only you would notice that.
Oh, I'm sure many people. They're going to be saying, oh, look, it's backwards. Paul is dead. So he's now right-handed. The guy that got to replace him is right-handed.
Exactly. No, that's the other thing too. I don't know if we discussed this in any conversations we've had, but a great movie. If you haven't seen it, believe me, we still once in a while will pull it up to watch it, called Nowhere Man.
Oh, yeah.
It was done a few years ago.
Or Nowhere Boy.
Nowhere Boy. I'm thinking of the song. And there's a young man, and I'm blanking on his name. He was the young boy that was in the movie Love Actually. So now this is 5 or 6 years later. He was the one that was holed up in the bedroom when the father says, oh, you want to be something like Ringo? And he goes, he's just like, Ringo is, again, no love for Ringo,
Yes.
But
I know who you're talking about. I can't remember his name, but I know who.
But now, 5 or 6 years later, of course, he's grown a little bit, still kind of, thin, fits, the way these gentlemen look back in the day.
Sure.
And he was cast as a young McCartney. But the thing about it that I was thoroughly impressed, if I ever got a chance to speak to this young man now, probably in his late 20s, was that he learned how to play the guitar and he learned how to play left-handed.
Left-handed.
Which is remarkable.
Yeah.
I mean, for an actor, but boy, you want to talk about some serious crash time lessons for about a month or two. And again, I'm sure they did what Hollywood, or in this case, a British film, did to try to minimize it, but still to have to learn how to pull it off. I thought that was quite impressive.
I don't know if I could do it. Learn to play guitar left-handed. I don't know.
I can't play guitar. Period. Much.
Well, I can barely play right-handed.
No, you do, because you even have a CD that we talked about last time with some tunes. Here's an homage again to the Beatles. We talked about earlier. For those of you who are too young to remember what a 45 looks like, believe me, I still love when I see them, no matter how beat up sometimes they are. And then the beauty of it, especially with these guys, was then the B side sometimes was as good, if not better, than the A side.
Sometimes, yeah.
Oh yeah.
The one that comes to mind is Paperback Writer is the A side and Rain is the B side. Much as I like Paperback Writer,
and you'll see that in a little bit. We have an image of actually I think the British 45 release, which of course now, just like the albums we talked about last time, the order was different, which may be why Ringo didn't have a song here. He might have had one there. Yeah. Never understood why the U.S. version. I think they had the same number of cuts, but then they were always different. So you'd have like Nowhere Man or something, or I Saw Her Standing There might be on this album or that album, and it was just like, hello. So when they finally released the whole box set, I think they did it via the British listing. For
the most part. The one exception is Magical Mystery Tour, because in Britain it was released as a double EP. It had 6 tracks, and in the States it was released as a full album, and it included things like Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, and things that were released as singles in Britain, they put on a full album in the States. So the box set that was released 8 years ago, 2009, had all the English albums except for Mystery Tour, which was the American album.
And speaking of Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, was it something in your book, it might have been George Martin, that said it was a regret that, I guess, that wasn't included in the album because it was released, like you said, as like an EP or just as singles?
Yeah, it was released as a double A-side single in, I think, February of '67, and they didn't want to double dip. They didn't want to release the same music as a single and as an album. Now in the States, that's common practice, but in Britain that was not how you did it. And so George, in one of his books, George wrote a couple of books, and one of them he says, releasing Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane as a single instead of On Sgt. Pepper was the biggest mistake of my career. And I actually wrote a blog about this several years ago, and one of my friends saw it on Facebook and wrote back, man, I wish the biggest mistake of my career was releasing 2 of the greatest songs ever in the history of popular music. So, yeah, point taken. It was still pretty good even without those.
And in those days, and I was a young boy at the time, I think American Bandstand, Ed Sullivan, Hollywood Palace, I'm sure I'm forgetting, but at least 3 that come to mind, all aired the same 2 videos, like, in other words, because at that point the Beatles weren't doing any, at least in the U.S. television. I mean, Harrison appeared on the Smothers Brothers, but that was kind of almost like a cameo thing. But everything else was either film or maybe in Britain they might have done 1 or 2 things. But it was just, there was this frenzy, and then when they showed that, and people didn't care. No one's saying, well, I just saw that on Hollywood Palace, or I just saw that on Sullivan. They were like, oh, bring it on, because we didn't have DVDs or VCRs.
You can't go on YouTube.
You didn't have YouTube. I mean, people don't understand that, you had to take what you got, and you had to that's why the old joke, you could live in a complex, and all of a sudden the plumbing would get a workout simultaneously because people didn't get out of their seats until the commercial came on. Now we just watch on demand, and we just
pause live TV.
Live TV,
resume.
Sure. I was going to say the only thing with on demand is they're smart. They don't let you fast forward. But anyway, Aaron Krerowicz, author, Beatles scholar, joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. Flipside Beatles, Volume 1, Beatles Band of the 60s. And a little bit later, we'll be talking about the flip side, which is Star Time, a celebration of Ringo. Let's back up a little bit. You started to talk or touch on it. Let's talk about the pre-Beatles band that John Lennon essentially founded, and talk a little bit about the various members and how they came to join the band, because I got to see that when I saw that movie we spoke of earlier. But your book goes into a little bit more detail of who came and went and what eventually molded into this superstar.
So a couple of days ago, after one of my talks, someone asked me, why is it John, Paul, George, and Ringo. You know, why not Ringo and Paul and John and George, or any other permutation of that? Why is it John, Paul, George, and Ringo? And part of the answer, I think, is because that's the order in which they joined the band. So John founds in either late 56 or early 57. No one's really quite sure when the band was actually started. It's not the kind of thing that they wrote down because no one thought that they'd be going anywhere. But anyway, late 56 or early 57, John starts a band with his buddies at Quarrybank Grammar School, and they call themselves the Quarrymen because of the school. And so Paul joins, let's see, they meet, it was July 5th, 57 is when John and Paul meet for the first time, and so John invites Paul to join the band. And then the following February 58 is when George joins. George was a buddy of Paul's, and so when Paul joins the band, he tells John, hey, I've got this buddy George Harrison, you should audition him in your band too. And so George joins. And then George is largely responsible for bringing in Ringo. And so Ringo joins in August of 62. And so he's the last of the four. He's the final piece of the puzzle, as the words that I use in the book. And so that's the order that they joined the Beatles. John starts, then Paul, then George, then Ringo. And that has persisted. 50 years later, we still call them John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Now that term, I would think came about probably once they came to America, because obviously what were they, or was anybody even using that term when Pete Best was in the band? It wasn't John, Paul, George, and Pete. I mean, it just doesn't, I don't know, there's something about the cadence, even though it's not alphabetically the way some people, like when you see in order of appearance or in order of alphabetical, you know, stars, you know, they have so this way no one's offended, you know, so the A's go first, the Z's, but in this case, so it really should have been George, John, Paul, and Ringo.
if you go that.
But I don't think John would have gone for that.
I don't think John would have gone for that either.
Yeah.
In fact, there are one of the really interesting things about this band is the first recording that they ever make is a single. The A side is "That'll Be the Day" by Buddy Holly, and the B side is "In Spite of All the Danger," which is uniquely credited McCartney Harrison. It's the only song credited McCartney Harrison. Wow. Anyway, Paul wrote it. It's Paul's song, but who sings lead on it? Not Paul, it's John. Why? Because he's the leader of the band. And Paul is deferential, especially in the early years. Now later on, they flip-flop and Paul becomes the leader to a point where Sgt. Pepper is ultimately Paul's album. You know, 8.5 of the 13 tracks are written by Paul. But in the early years, it's very much John's band. So even though Paul writes "In Spite of All the Danger," he's deferential to John, and John sings lead on that recording.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, that came out even in that movie, and again, not to harp just on that Nowhere Boy, but again, it just really focused on those years of, you know, him and the whole thing with his mom really not being in the picture, and then his Aunt Mimi, that, you know, and then at the end, they allegedly pay, you know, to record like in a recording studio, and I believe the song you mentioned, which probably they focused on because it was in effect an original and not the Buddy Holly one. They showed them, and I believe those actors and the other folks that were, quote, in the band at that time actually sang the vocals on it collectively, and it was, you know, it was pretty impressive. But I didn't realize it was McCartney Harrison. I just assumed it was at that point already a joint John Paul collaboration.
I don't believe John had anything to do with the songwriting,
no, at that point,
but he did sing it.
Yeah, and I think his writing skills. I mean, he was a poet basically. If someone were to ask, "Oh, I write some poetry," and I think, you know, that probably, I think, bothered him a little bit because Paul seemed to, for whatever reason, maybe because of his upbringing with his dad and he was a musician, whatever, just seemed to gravitate towards lyrical content, whereas John was more of a struggle. You know, and he did well in later years too, but I think, I think if one analyzed it correctly, I think really McCartney really was the one that I think drove that twosome, and that's fine. You've got Rodgers and Hammerstein, you've got Rodgers and Hart. I mean, there's always somebody, you know, Elton John, Bernie Taupin. Okay, in some cases, one did the lyrics, one did the music. in the case of Lennon and McCartney, that was not the case. I think it was.
They both wrote their own lyrics and music, but what's really interesting is the kind of rivalry between the two of them. So I have a program called Two Sides of the Same Coin, the Lennon-McCartney dynamic, and what I do in that program is go through the entire span of the Beatles, looking at how John and Paul often will use the same ideas, the same songwriting techniques, but in very different ways. So for example, Paul writes Can't Buy Me Love, and it's a 12-bar blues, which is like the most standard chord progression in pop music. And so he does that song, and then about a month later, less than a month later, John comes in with You Can't Do That. And it too is a 12-bar blues. Even the titles, Can't Do That and Can't Buy Me Love, the word can't, like it's so clearly one reacting to the other. And you can trace that throughout the Beatles' entire career. John does something and Paul says, hey, that's really cool what you're doing, John. I'm going to use the same idea in my song.
Oh, okay.
And then Paul does something, and then John listens to that and he says, wow, that's really cool what you're doing, Paul. I'm going to use the same idea for my own song. And so the two of them are so intertwined with each other. You can't separate John from Paul, because what makes them so special is that it's John and Paul. It's the two of them working together that creates some of the best music ever made.
Aaron Krerowicz joining us for the hour on Studio 411. The book Flipside Beatles, Volume 1, a Beatles band of the 60s, and the Flipside, Side B, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Star Time, a celebration of Ringo, that being Ringo Starr. Just to digress for a moment, there was a thing since you were last here, and just a quick comment if you have it. I guess the determination, the powers that be, that now the song Imagine is now credited to Lennon and Yoko Ono. Any thoughts on that? Were you surprised? Were you like, oh, okay, what's the big deal? I mean, any opinion on that?
I'd heard that there was a movement to try and change that. I hadn't heard if it was successful or not.
Believe,
did they actually?
Several months, I believe it was.
So I have to say I'm a little bit surprised, because Paul very famously tried to get the song Yesterday to be credited more to him, McCartney Lennon, as opposed to Lennon McCartney. John had nothing to do with the song Yesterday.
Right.
And so Paul tried to make that change, and he failed. And in large part because Yoko refused. And so for Yoko then to turn around and say, well, Imagine isn't, actually, was that even credited, Lennon McCartney?
No, that point was just Lennon.
It was just Lennon,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So what she's done is add her name, not change it.
No, Lennon / Ono, because apparently whatever written things or comments that even he made, perhaps recordings or transcripts. In effect, he stated something to the effect of, she deserves half the credit for me writing this song. So in other words, did he mean it in a legal sense? I don't know, but obviously as,
we'll never know.
executrix, I assume, of his estate.
Right. She can do what she wants.
Yeah, do what. I don't know in terms of money. She's getting it all anyway. But
she's getting it all anyway.
Yeah, but I just found it interesting. So Lennon once said that he grew up in Hamburg, not Liverpool. Not physically, but in terms of mentally, physically, spiritually, musically. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I would say he matured a great deal in Hamburg.
He needed to, from what I've read.
Well, yeah. In some ways, he didn't mature in Hamburg either. But yeah, I think what that quote means is that he learned how to he learned how to be an adult in Hamburg. He learned how to deal with life in Hamburg in a way that he didn't have to in Liverpool, because he always had his friends and family there to support him and help take care of him. And when he's in Hamburg, he doesn't have that. He's on his own for the first time in his life, and he has to decide for himself what to do and how to do it and how to go about doing the things that he wants to do. So none of the Beatles. I suspect Hamburg is the equivalent of a modern day high school kid going off to college. Being out from your parents' house, living on your own, deciding for yourselves, what to eat, how to, when do you go to bed? All these things that are a lot of the times are taken care of for you, like meals are taken care of for you when you're living at home, and when you leave home, you have to take care of yourself. You have to learn to live independently. And I think that's what John means when he calls Hamburg, when he says, I grew up in Hamburg, not Liverpool. That's where he learned how to live on his own, independently as an adult.
I'm going to do my magic trick, and we're magically going to flip the book. I was going to say fix. No, flip the book, he said. And we're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Starr, Ringo.
Oh, yes.
There we go. And there he is, looking dazed and confused. Natural or unnatural, I don't know. But anyway, of course, Ringo, always been a favorite of mine. I think for the reasons, always you thought of him as the underdog.
The most homely.
Yeah, and I mean, even in his post-Beatle recording career, his first album, I think, was called Sentimental Journey.
Yeah,
it was a bunch of songs, nothing, I don't think, written by him, but it was a bunch of songs, kind of like Paul, what they were all raised on, songs that were probably standards in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And I think he once said something about he recorded the album because these were songs that his mom liked. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
And that fits perfectly with what Ringo is all about.
Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily, a big blockbuster success, but I just remember that was something he wanted to do. And then the first song that caught my eye, or ear, I should say, was actually, I think, his second big single. I liked Back Off Boogaloo. I thought that was cool. And I always liked who was the producers, whatever. It was either like George Harrison or Todd Rundgren. I mean, he always had people, he'd say, I know these people, so that was pretty cool. Mm-hmm. But the one that caught my ear was probably the best Ringo song that I like. It's called It Don't Come Easy. Mm-hmm. But the flip side was a song kind of autobiographical in nature called Early 1970. You remember that song or no?
I have to admit the post-Beatles breakup stuff, the solo career, I'm aware of, but I do not consider myself an expert at all. That's one you want to check out because it, I don't analyze it, or study it like the way you do and other folks that are, really into the lyric content, whatever. But apparently the song does kind of vaguely or, deal with the kind of leading up to the breakup, in early 70. And frankly, some will say by 69, it pretty much we're over and done with. I mean, you talk about, I think in the book, an interview that was like 1 or 2 word answers. I think it was in April that year that McCartney did it. I mean, at that point, it was pretty much dead on arrival as far as I was concerned. No touring, nope. No records, nope. I mean, it was just basically. And by then, they all had most solo projects out. Mm-hmm. They were all going their own separate ways. Someone once asked me if the Beatles broke up because they ran out of gas. And I said, no, they didn't run out of gas. There was plenty of gas in the tank. There were just 4 different drivers going down 4 different roads and 4 different cars at 4 different speeds to 4 different destinations. They were all working independently of one another. They weren't working together as a band. They were 4 separate individual musicians as opposed to one collective ensemble.
Now, in the book on Ringo, Star Time, you break it down into 4 categories: personality, his drumming, as a singer, again, singer with the Beatles. Although, again, he certainly has had 40 plus years, nearly 50 years as a solo artist.
I think 19 albums as a solo album.
And as you said, I think actually we even have a shot later on of his most recent one. And what you were saying, what was it called? Need More Love?
Give More Love.
Give More Love. But that's, I don't think that's necessarily a direct correlation with your assessment or the fans that you've talked to. I think it's just he's so much into this whole peace and love thing that, in other words, he's just saying that the way I took it was the state of affairs in the world today, and it just seems in his mind probably ever increasing that we just need more love.
But, he's not referring to him getting more love. No, he's saying the world.
I think at this point he's got plenty.
He's got still not as much as John, Paul, and George, but he still gets a lot.
I think didn't he finally get elected into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? He was as a solo artist.
Was it 2 years ago? 2015, I think.
And I thought
give or take.
I thought that was long overdue, but that's a whole other story with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Personality, drumming, singer, and as a songwriter, and there's one of Ringo's solo efforts just to get a look at the hardware on those fingers.
Yeah, right.
Now, a question. Did he play the drums always with those rings on his fingers?
That's a really good question. I assume he did, but I don't know that for sure. My best guess is that he did.
when you were with us the last time, it was very close. It might have just come out, or I know I saw it.
Yeah.
The Ron Howard movie. Did you ever check that out? What did you
saw
think of that?
I was actually in Springfield, Missouri last September when the film debuted, and there was a friend. I was doing a talk in Springfield, and one of my friends there said, "Do you want to go see the film on opening night?" And I said, "Absolutely, I want to go see the film on opening night." And so I saw it in the theater. The place was packed, and I thought the documentary did a very good job of capturing fans' emotional connection to the phenomenon. Because I consider myself a scholar. I try to be as objective as I can with my analyses. I don't want my books and my presentations to be about me. It's about the band and their music, and so I try not to get overly emotionally attached or involved in what I'm doing. Now, of course, I wouldn't spend all this time and effort doing it if I weren't emotionally attached to it. I am, but I try to minimize that because I'm trying to be objective and scholarly. And Ron Howard did not take that approach at all. He wanted to be more objective, more subjective, more emotional, and I thought he did a spectacular job of capturing that feeling.
I mean, just the celebrity comments, Whoopi Goldberg, Tom Hanks, I mean, on and on and on. I mean, It was remarkable. And then the thing that I enjoyed, and I had seen it, and I honestly don't recall when that was, but probably back in the late 60s, early to mid 70s, the Shea Stadium concert, which in this case, he actually tacked on to the end. The only difference was, for those of us who had black and white sets, got to see Ed Sullivan introduce them in living color. And I thought that was pretty cool. I can understand from what you've talked about and other presentations you've done. By that time, I mean, they were lucky they could follow each other's cues. And as George elaborated, I think they were starting to feel like fearful for their safety at that point.
Often, yeah. There's a famous quote from Ringo saying he couldn't hear what John, Paul, and George were playing. So the only way he could tell where the beat was to watch John's bum go up and down with the music. And so he'd watch that, and he'd play in time with. And
do you know that whether you put that in my head or whatever, I actually watched it, and I've seen others like the Candlestick Park concert and a few others that are on YouTube or whatever. And I got to tell you, it's seamless. I mean, you really can't tell. I mean, they do a hell of a job.
Well, they're spectacular musicians. I mean, nothing about this band matters if their music is not first rate. They were fantastic musicians.
Back to Ringo here again. Personality again. Obviously, Pete Best, who appears to be a very loving guy, a very nice man, but just right down from the haircut, the whole demeanor, just. You could tell from reading your book, it just was not going to fit in with this group.
Yeah, he was the obvious man out when you look at the band, when you listen to the band. He's in many ways it's a tribute to him. Like he didn't conform. He wanted to be himself. He didn't want to do the forward hair over the forehead like all the others did. He wanted to do his own style. He wanted to do his own thing, and there's something to be said for that. Yeah. But it's not what this band needed. The band needed a drummer who would match the rest of them, both in musical abilities and in physical appearance and in wit. The way that Ringo deals with the press, the way he handles himself in interviews, could hardly be more different from the way Pete handled himself. And so it's not saying Pete's a bad person or anything.
No, not at all.
I do think he wasn't the greatest drummer, but I don't think he was a bad drummer.
Right. In George Martin's eyes, he was not technical enough for what George felt that he needed.
Yes. Yeah. And I actually just got onto a bit of a YouTube debate with a guy in which he said it's unfair to judge Pete based on one bad performance. And I said, yes, you're absolutely right. That is unfair. But it's what George Martin did.
Absolutely.
And George Martin's decision had a profound impact on the rest of the Beatles' career. So fair or not, that's still what happened.
Absolutely. Ringo, of course, had come from playing with a gentleman named Rory Storm.
Rory Storm and the Hurricanes.
So he was, I think in many circles, and you and I talked about this the last time you were here, there are people today, again, that believe, especially when it came to maintaining this steady beat. You know, another one like that is Mick Fleetwood with Fleetwood Mac.
Okay.
You know, that just, again, we're not saying he was the most, you know, Gene Krupa of the world.
Right.
But the thing was, for what this band needed, and
Yes.
frankly, and I came to appreciate it even more with the different musical analysis you do, from notes and rhythms and beats and drum, you know, patterns, that, again, the four of them plus Martin combined, he came across very good. I mean, later years, sure, he'd get up on stage and, you know, he was just doing it to get by. But the thing is, he
With a
can
little help from
drum,
his
and he
friends.
still, with a little help from his friends. As a singer, you know, I loved Act Naturally. You know, it was an old, not old, a couple of years before, a fellow Capitol Records
Buck
bandmate,
Owens.
Buck Owens,
Yeah.
and he did a marvelous job on that. Was the flip side of Yesterday, if I recall, here at least in the States.
Yep.
Yellow Submarine, you know, and stuff. But, you know, frankly, in those later years, I don't really think he got much of an opportunity. So I think at that point, he probably was itching to get out, you know. I mean, he did Octopus's Garden.
Yeah, he got some chances. Like on the White Album, he sings Good Night.
Yeah.
That's a John song, but John gives it to Ringo because it's a lullaby. It's written for John's, let's see, then 5-year-old son, Julian. Julian was born 63. This was 68. So he would have been 5 years old. And but rather than John sing it, he defers to Ringo. And I think the reason is because Ringo has that childlike character in his voice that is perfectly suited for a lullaby written for a child. Right. And so John could have been an egomaniac and said, "This is my song. I'm going to sing everything I wrote," kind of like he did with Paul. He's like, you wrote the song, but I'm going to take it from you because I'm the leader of the band, right? He could have done the same thing on the White Album with Good Night. He could have said, "I'm going to sing this because it's my song," but he knew that Ringo's voice was better suited to the character of that song. And rather than hog the spotlight, John says, "Okay, Ringo, you take this because you're going to do a better job with it than
Another one that I liked, and it's just a personal observation, I think, was from the Yesterday and Today album. Again, in this country, I don't presume to know all the machinations. Was it on the British release, on what album, whatever, but was called, What Goes On? And he wrote that, and I thought that was quite a good song. Again, not A-list material for a single, but I thought...
Not spectacular,
yeah,
but it's good.
But I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was on the British version of Rubber Soul.
Oh, really?
And,
there you go.
In the book, I talk a little bit about how it's credited Lennon, McCartney, Starkey.
Yes.
But Ringo was once asked, "How much did you contribute?" And he said about 5 words. And as it turns out, it's actually 6 words. In the second verse, there's the line, "Waiting for the tides of time." That was Ringo's contribution. Well, so he did get credit for it, but he really didn't.
And the same goes with, I believe it's It Don't Come Easy. There's some skeptics that I've read over the years who maintain that really Harrison wrote most of that, but it's credited just to Ringo. But obviously, I would hope a little more than just 5 words. But the thing was, clearly later on, Ringo, especially after he hooked up with this producer, well-known producer named Richard Perry, who did so many people, Carly Simon and Nielsen. I mean, and just totally, that's what he found his George Martin in his solo career. And sometimes if you do a segment on that, I think you'll see that really was the catalyst that then broke his career open. You know, in like '74, really when he came out with the Ringo album, that was really the rocket ship that catapulted him from just it's just Ringo. You know, then people started to have a little bit more respect. To me. Thank goodness for Yellow Submarine and with a little help from my friends, because if not for those two, then I could see where Ringo wouldn't get a lot of love. You know, I know Octopus's Garden, is another one, but the other two were, A-side singles. Those were, and he didn't write either one, but by his vocal ability, which again, I mean, Dylan is no Pavarotti, but Ringo is Ringo.
Well, Dylan's a very good Dylan.
Yeah.
And Ringo's a very good Ringo.
Some quotes here with Aaron Kadovich, the book Flipside Beatles Volume 1. We're talking about the flip side called Star Time, a celebration of Ringo. Max Weinberg, a longtime E Street Band drummer with the Bruce Springsteen. Ringo showed us that a day or night spent drumming is just about better than anything else. Chad Smith, Red Hot Chili Peppers, the greatest thing a drummer can contribute to a recorded song is the feel of it, and every Beatles song feels great. That to me, hands down, and I love all the comments here, just coming from a drummer, it says it all right there.
That says it all right there. Absolutely.
And that's why I always thought, even Lennon, again, when he said this, I don't know, Ringo is a damn good drummer. And even Martin, George Martin, Ringo is an excellent drummer. So again, excellent, probably when he compared Pete Best and Ringo.
Well, it's, Ringo's not the most flashy drummer, but he's exactly what the Beatles needed. They couldn't have found, the last words of the book, they couldn't have found anybody better. For what that band needed at that time, they couldn't have found anybody better than Ringo Starr.
Now you talked about maintain Ringo gets no love.
Right.
As I said earlier, I think he's done quite well for himself. Let me tell you.
I would say he's been quite successful. But in comparison to John, Paul, and George, who get heaps of consideration and accolades and all that, Ringo of the four of them, Ringo is the one who gets the least amount of love. And so I'm trying to give Ringo a little more love with the book.
Absolutely. And in the book, you talked about how it's a crapshoot, like doing this show. You never know how many people are going to watch this show. You do the best you can. You show up, you put your mic on, and you do your presentation with the best guests we can find, which we always love having folks like Aaron and all the folks that join us here on the program. But you've talked about in the book where you did a few presentations along the way where it was like almost like crickets that showed up because they're like Ringo. And to me I was like, wow. I would love to hear a conversation. By the way, there's that B side of that 45 we spoke of. I think that's
George Harrison.
I think that's the English release, not the U.S. version. But the A side was "It Don't Come Easy." And again, we're going to see an image of Ringo with the most recent album. As we wind down with Aaron Krerowicz, the book Flipside Beatles Volume 1. Let me ask now, will there be a Volume 2?
Yes, I have tentative plans for a total of 3 volumes, and each one would be a transcript of 2 of my programs. There'd be an A-side and a B-side for each of them. So this is Volume 1. Volume 2, I'm looking at the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. I have a whole program comparing and contrasting the Beatles and the Stones. So that would be the A-side of Volume 2. The B-side is the influence of American rock and roll on the Beatles. And so I've got, essentially, I look at all these artists from the 1950s, guys like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, the Everly Brothers, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, all these guys from the prior decade, and I look at how that set up the Beatles in the subsequent decade, right? What happens in the 50s sets up the 1960s. And so that would be the B-side of Volume 2.
There you go. Look at that. I see another show in the works with Aaron. There's, by the way, Ringo's album. I believe it was the first one that Richard Perry produced and had a bunch of hits, Photograph and Step Lively and just on and on and on. Devil Woman, great B-side of a track, and I'm just right now blanking on some of the others, but that was probably his best solo work during his long career. You mentioned Beatle influences in the remaining moments we have. Again, Everly Brothers from a vocal standpoint.
Very much so.
But now, I'll pin you down this way. Going by each member, starting with John, if you had to say number one musical influence, who would that be from your research? Because I know there was a thing where he had a jukebox that they found with all his 45s. He had like a miniature like jukebox or something, and that thing went at auction for like huge amounts of money. And he had the little things with the handwritten stuff, like he had some of the tunes they did, Please Mr. Postman, that kind of stuff. So he had very esoteric taste, not R&B, soul, rock and roll, whatever. But I'm just saying, any thoughts on who you think might have been the biggest influence on him?
I mean, if I have to pick one, it would be Elvis Presley, but that would be for all four of them.
Okay.
So if I have to pick one that's particularly influential on John Lennon, as opposed to being influential on the other three, probably Gene Vincent.
You just read my mind. Yeah,
really?
Yeah. Bebop-A-Lula.
Well, that's just it. Bebop-A-Lula is an early example of nonsense lyrics, or what are so-called nonsense lyrics. I actually hate that term because I think they make perfect musical sense, right? Bebop-A-Lula has inherent rhythm in it as you pronounce those phonetic syllables. There's inherent musical qualities of Bebop-A-Lula. And it's the same thing with that Lennon does. In other words, it's not far from Bebop-A-Lula to Goo Goo Ka-Choo.
Right, exactly. Yeah. There you go. I never thought of that. Yeah,
well, this is what I do.
And Gene Vincent, to his credit, had other tunes. You know, a guy that was injured severely in an auto accident and lived, but you know, really was physically impaired, among other issues that I believe he had. But anyway, what about Paul? Paul, I would think would be someone maybe more like an Everly Brothers or somebody a little bit more, or maybe a Buddy. I would say Buddy Holly, because he used to do a yearly homage tribute to him in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, again, all four of them were hugely influenced by Buddy Holly. But if I have to pick one for Paul, if I have to pick one that's most influential on Paul as opposed to the other three, probably Little Richard, and particularly the singing.
Yeah.
There's a quote from Paul: "I could do Little Richard's voice, which is a loud screaming kind of thing, and you have to go about a foot of above your head in order to sing it." And that's what Little Richard does on songs like Lucille, Long Tall Sally. You know, he's got that hoarse, screaming style vocal delivery, and Paul mimics that on several songs. Also the falsetto, you know, one of Little Richard's trademarks is the woo that he would do on every song. And the Beatles do that too, you know, and she loves you, you know, you should be glad. Ooh, it's the same thing. They borrow it straight from Little Richard.
A great B-side, as we were looking at a 45 earlier, featuring Paul, was a song he and Lennon wrote called "I'm Down," and I believe that was also in the tail end of the Ron Howard movie at Shea Stadium. If not, I saw it somewhere else. Again, they also featured clips from other things leading up to that in England and in Germany, etc. Also, I think in Scandinavia, some TV shows they did over there. But yeah, "I'm Down" is a great homage to Little Richard. For sure.
It's Paul explicitly channeling Little Richard's style.
Now, George, I'm going to take a crack and say Carl Perkins.
That's exactly where I'm going.
Because Carl just, you know, was. George is all over that.
Yeah, and there in 1960, the Beatles went on a tour backing Johnny Gentle. He was the star, and the Beatles were the backing group. And so they all adopted showbiz names, stage names. And so Paul famously becomes Paul Ramon, and George becomes Carl Harrison after Carl Perkins. And that shows how much George loved Carl.
One last thing on Ringo, or I should say his son. I got to see his son on several occasions with The Who. Scary to think that Zach is like already has passed the 50-year mark.
And Julian Lennon.
But Zach, I mean, what do you think of his drumming?
I know of Zach's drumming. I've heard very good things. It's not the kind of thing that I've studied and analyzed and digested the way I have Ringo's Beatles drumming. So I just feel like I haven't done the homework necessary to really critique what Zach has done. But I've heard nothing but good things.
Now, does doing all these talks ever get overwhelming?
I wouldn't say overwhelming, but I would say fatiguing. Just being on the road. For example, you know, we're recording this on October 26th, 27th. I think it's 26th. I left home on September 30th, so it's been about 4 weeks since I've slept in my own bed.
Wow!
And I love it. I wouldn't do this if I didn't love it. But doing it that much is certainly fatiguing, and there are times where I get tired. I don't lose enthusiasm. I still love what I do, but just the physical traveling for weeks at a time does take a toll. I have to.
Well, we'll give him a break, and we'll definitely have him back. Aaron Kadovich, a Beatles scholar, he said, author. His latest effort, Flipside Beatles Volume 1, Beatles Band of the 60s, and on the flip side, Side B, Star time a celebration of Ringo. So Aaron, as always, I can't thank you enough.
It's been a pleasure.
Look forward to having you back on.
I'd love to be back.
And always appreciate, again, traveling from Middle America, folks. But
yes.
Of course, he's sleeping on a few couches along the way. So
more than a few.
All righty, we've reached the end of another episode of Studio 411. Larry Dasilva, your host. We thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you join us again, and we will see you next time. Take care.